Good day, everyone, and welcome to Moving Active Surveillance to the Next Level, which is being sponsored and presented by the Active Surveillance Coalition, which is a group that was created by a number of support groups from several locations and countries. And I'm Joe Gallo, and I'd like to just hit a couple of quick administrative points as we go along, and then we'll get totally into the program. Everyone should be aware, you hear these disclaimers, but this is important, that anything that is presented today that you hear or see is not intended to be a recommendation from a medical perspective. If you have something that you find that is very interesting, please approach your own medical team for further pursuance. And with that, I think I'd asked several, but I'll mention it again. If you can change your name to include your location, your country, or particular location, that would be beneficial to all of us. And with that, I would like to introduce our initial host, Mark Lichty, who is the chairman of ASPI, Active Surveillance Patients International.
Good afternoon to you all. This is being produced by a coalition of organizations, and the organizations include Active Surveillance Patients International, Prostate Cancer Research Institute, Answer Cancer, Prostate Cancer Canada, and Howard Walensky's Active Surveiller newsletter. And I would really recommend Howard's newsletter to you all. He's kind of on the leading edge. The newsletter's on the leading edge of information on active surveillance. And if you haven't signed up on it, I'd recommend that. All of the men who produced this have been through the process of active surveillance. For most of us, it was a wild ride, anxious and uncomfortable. And we're here now because we have, most of us there's somebody that's not muted. Bill, can you mute everybody? We're here now because we have reached some level of peace in this process. And believe it or not, you too can find that same peace as well. And we had noticed a lack of clear guidance for men on active surveillance and how to navigate it. So that's why we created a series that we call Active Surveillance 101. Still getting some kind of sound in the background, so we should be sure to mute everybody. Active Surveillance Patients International and the coalition is having a profound effect on prostate cancer by reaching out and learning about best practices internationally. We are here to speak with credibility to professional organizations like the American Urological Association. You might be surprised to learn that organizations like the American Urological Association really value our opinion and they want to listen to you. When we learned that nations in Europe and some learning centers here in the United States were at 90% adherence to active surveillance, we wanted to do what we could to move the needle in that direction, to further our work on avoiding overtreatment of prostate cancer and preserving your quality of life. And we want to mention too that all of the presenters here are leaders in their fields and are doing this as volunteers. They don't receive any compensation. And we've helped many men avoid overtreatment and overbiopsy. We are focusing our efforts at helping you to find some peace in the process. Anxious men often get overtreated. When you do go on active surveillance, when you go on the active surveillance journey, you can have a rich quality of life, as most of us who are now on that are enjoying. We're in the process of creating future active surveillance 101 programs, and we look forward to your input on them. We want to work with you to create a peaceful vigilance around your journey. Active Surveillance Patients International and all of the organizations here are in need of volunteers. So if anybody is excited about being here today, please reach out to any of us, and I'm sure there's some things that we could have you involved in supporting the process of active surveillance. And with that, I'd like to introduce my good friend, Howard Walensky.
Well, thanks, Mark. And not only good afternoon, but good evening and good morning to all of you. And we appreciate your coming. Active surveillance has been an overnight success. I'll put quotes around that, as a management strategy for low-risk prostate cancer. It only took 30 years to catch on. It started in Canada and the United States in the late 1990s. It came to Europe 5 to 10 years later. Early active surveillance proponents were ridiculed by surgery-happy urology leaders. As a result, the US has lagged far behind in active surveillance, while major gains have been made in other geographies. In 2010, when I was diagnosed, only 6% of us went on active surveillance. Of course, you know what happened to the remaining 94%. Surgery, radiation, and their side effects, an epidemic of damage caused by unnecessary treatment. There has been a revolution in adoption of active surveillance for low-risk prostate lesions in patients in Canada, UK, Sweden, and Holland, and the state of Michigan, which seems to be a country in itself. It's Sweden in America. The acceptance rate in these places has been in the high 80 to 95%. But in the US, our acceptance rate for active surveillance finally reached 60% last year. Realize there's been a rapid growth, but we started out slow. Today, we will have 3 speakers whose active surveillance programs for low-risk prostate cancer patients have reached into the high 80s up to the mid 90s. They will share the secrets of their success, and I hope that they'll be able to tell us how we as patients can make a difference in spreading their ideas and how they can help spread their ideas. Our speakers today are Dr. Chris Bangma from Erasmus Medical Center in Rotterdam, the Netherlands, Dr. Vincent Nana Pragasam from the University of Cambridge, and Kevin Ginsberg from Wayne State in Detroit in Michigan. Each will speak for about 15 minutes, followed by a 15-minute discussion amongst the doctors, and then we'll open up to questions from the audience. Chris will go first. He's been called the father of active surveillance in Europe, and has been the principal investigator in major studies of active surveillance. Vincent will follow. He has championed the PREDICT prostate algorithm, and I'll put a plug in for that in the chat box when I finish. And he's done many other things to advance the cause of patients with prostate cancer. And he's from University of Cambridge. And then Kevin, who's prostate cancer leader for the Michigan Urological Surgery Collaborative, will speak. They've shown a path to achieve 90% uptake of active surveillance in all types of urology practices. Unfortunately, our 4th speaker, Dr. Ahlberg from Uppsala University Hospital in Sweden, was himself admitted to the hospital with a slip disc and was unable to participate. I'm going to do my best to represent a Swedish point of view. I will share a story I wrote about Sweden. So I'll turn this over to Chris now.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Howard. And thank you very much, the SPI organization, for organizing this again and inviting us for information that might support this worldwide view on the management of low-risk cancers. I've got the privilege that Bill is going to show my slides, still looking at the Swedish component Howard at my screen. Let's see whether we can manage. Marvelous. And this looks like the Netherlands, wide, flat and dull. And this is more where I'm staying in my daily life. It is the Erasmus University Medical Center in Rotterdam. And we're talking about how can we help more patients. That's the title for today, in order to optimize the strategy for people with low risk cancers. And I'm going to inform you a little bit how we did in the Netherlands, which might have been an example for others to follow in our direct surroundings. And we've learned quite a lot from this collaboration with everybody. So can we help more patients? Next slide, please. First, of course, I have to tell that I'm connected intensely to active surveillance studies and organizations, as you can read over here. And the background from the Rotterdam University is that we organized the European screening study for prostate cancer back in the 90s already. And now we have almost 30 years follow-up. So we have learned a lot from all those 180,000 men in Europe that were randomized for screening or not screening. And they taught us with their individual clinical lessons what is dangerous, what is not dangerous. And from that experience, actually, here in Europe, we were able to extract what is needed to look at patients with very low-risk cancers. Who are the candidates and what are the parameters to look for? And it's still changing every day with more experience. Next slide, please. So very contradictorily, I'd say we would like to help less people, because active surveillance is just an emergency strategy. If we would not diagnose all those low risk tumors that will never live up to symptoms during life, that would be marvelous. But unfortunately, it's always a bit of both. If you are going to detect a cancer that is relevant at an early time frame, then you might pick up cancers that are of low risk. And so therefore it's unavoidable that we do some active surveillance, but we'd like to do less. Because every cancer diagnosis, to our experience, gives cancer anxiety. It might be very short, but it might also be very profound and long lasting. And as was indicated at the introduction, this might lead to overtreatment. So that means patients or his spouse and the physician might feel pushed in order to go for treatment, while it might not be really necessary to do so. What we've learned from screening, and nowadays screening is completely different from what we did in the 90s and at the beginning of the 21st century, is that you have to screen quite a number of people, 600, to be diagnosed 15 with prostate cancer at an early stage. And then treating all those, you only save one life dying of prostate cancer. So it means you have to do quite a bit of effort in early detection, and therefore this detection will lead to overdiagnosis. So it's unavoidable. It's a catch-22. Next slide, please. We can only try to improve the ways we are screening and the ways we are doing follow-up. You're almost all of you very familiar with this very famous graph from North America explaining cancers in animals. and you're very lucky when you're diagnosed with a snail that is only moving very slowly forward, but still you know that you have it. Most men on active surveillance will have a very slow moving prostate cancer. And those that are going for screening in order to detect relevant cancers are here indicated at the top. And as Howard was saying, we're already doing active surveillance, managing these slow cancers for 30 years. So maybe we as physicians also are looking a little bit like turtles, moving very, very slowly forward with active surveillance. There's a bit of noise at the background now, but I hope it doesn't disturb you. And someone is typing. Maybe that can stop. Can we go to the next slide? Yes, the previous one, but this is also good. Because this shows you actually the distribution of the cancer diagnosis around the world. And luckily, we're sitting here from many nations and at least 2 continents together in this meeting. And we belong to the areas in which cancer is diagnosed very often. In contrast, for example, to the Far East Asian countries, or maybe the Latin America countries. Next slide. And the next slide is interesting because it shows the difference where you die of cancer, prostate cancer, especially in African countries, and where cancer is very often being diagnosed, and you might die less often of it. And this slide can only be interpreted as such that there is a large discrepancy in the nature of prostate cancer, in the maybe the changes of prostate cancer around the world, in the detection strategies and the way of treatments. And it's very difficult to compare one country with another, but it shows our variation and diversity. That's the reason why we focus a little bit more to the Netherlands. Next slide. The central question that was asked is, how can we reach those men that have low-risk cancer and do not know about active surveillance? Because they should be informed about this potential strategy for them. And of course, complementary to that is how can we reach their physicians, because they are as important in the management, of course, and the selection of treatment. Next slide. We haven't been doing so badly over time, because here you see the graphs of the largest registry of active surveillance patients around the world that was supported by the Movember organization from 2014 onwards. And it shows actually the pickup of active surveillance, especially in Europe and Northern America. That's the blue and the purple graph line over the years. And because of the nature of prostate cancer, it was very low to include in Asian countries, but it also might be dependent on the health system. So most of us are not so very bad off with the systems we are living in. And of course, Australia, also very active country in active surveillance. The absolute numbers are low, but the pickup was extremely good. So we have been picking up. Now, next slide is perfect, because now we focus on the Netherlands. And this is how we started in 2006. We tried to explain, but also to involve physicians and patients into the strategy that they could pick up from the internet. And this is a very, very simple example how we managed internet at that moment. As you might have experienced that in the Netherlands, the use of public services and internet is extremely high. So everybody's using it for their work or in their domestic area. And so therefore this was a perfect technology for us to start active surveillance. And it's protected because every patient got a number for their entry, and they gave that number to their physician that was allowed to enter their page. And on the right-hand side, you see the diversity of people living in the Netherlands with very many languages also, very comparable to the States or any other place in Europe in which our patients are very international, with explanation of active surveillance in many languages. Next slide. And the interesting thing that people appreciated were two things. First of all, you could see their protocol, their individual protocol. And of course, that has altered over time. And the left side, you can see their individual PSA. So while with their physician on the website, you could enter their PSA and a graph and a median graph would appear. In former times, this PSA was far more important than it is currently, but still PSA is kind of a magic measurement for many people and easy to understand, and therefore definitely also illustrating how it is going and with their cancer and the speed of growth. Next slide. So this was a successful item, but there were other elements in the Netherlands that made the active surveillance pickup quite high amongst physicians and amongst patients. We're only 70 million people on a very small spot on this marvelous globe, I'd say. And that means that we serve with 450 certified urologists that have to register every 5 years and all have to follow courses during those times. Those 70 million people. We've got 19 hospitals, so it means that we have an average of 4 or 5 urologists per hospital, and they inform each other. Of course, nowadays, many of them are specialized, and we've got very special prostate centers in which radiotherapists and urologists and oncologists are working together, radiologists, very closely in high numbers. But the pivotal item is we're close together. All of our patients have had health insurances. So that means there was no deliberation about money. Everybody was being served. And most of our physicians, certainly at that time when we were starting, but definitely at this time, do not have any commercial interest in, for example, performing operations, because doing more doesn't say that you will earn more. It's all the interest in finances in these hospitals are capitated. So that means you can't do more and earn more. There's a very high confidence culture in the Netherlands. I mean, there's a trust in doctors. They're criticized by their patients when they have their realistic view on what is happening to them, but they are respected very highly. It's one of the most respected professions still in our society. So it means that what you bring to your patient, also about active surveillance and information, is being trusted. We integrate our research and our ongoings and our progress with patient representatives. There's an organization of patient representatives, and that is necessarily involved in all of our research applications. For example, on running an application on food and what to use during active surveillance, and we're doing randomized studies on that. And the patients have been involved in the design of those studies. So that as a result, there's an enormous patient awareness. And that, of course, is very beneficial for the pickup rate of active surveillance. For the last few years, the access to MRI, that in contrast to very many other places in this world, has been very high because the actual MRI support and development came largely also from the Netherlands. But what we do not have, for example, at this moment is the reimbursement of genetic tests. So, I mean, there's also for us, there's still things to be developed and to be incorporated in our schemes. And last thing I'd want to say about this pickup rate is that people and physicians are interested in developing and further developing. So we are developing risk-based protocols or algorithms or whatever you call it, based on our large experience now over the last 20 years of the clinical features that accompany the patients and all the technological developments that we have been put on paper and in registries. So that was, this is the magic list from the Netherlands. I'm very curious, of course, about other countries that might be in part be very comparable. Next slide. The next slide shows you what was indicated. Not a 90%, it's an 85%, but the bottom lines show you the traditional strategies for treating low-risk prostate cancer with operations and also with radiation therapy. The top line shows you the still increasing rate of picking up active surveillance. So there's enormous confidence in this, this strategy, and I think that I've showed that we are doing well. Next slide. And this will be my last slide because it only represents our common ground with patients, developing together a more personalized monitoring tool when you are on prostate, on active surveillance, to monitor your prostate by imaging, by maybe in the future genetic tools, but definitely by the clinical tools that we have at this moment, at a rate that is needed for your cancer and not being based on just a protocol, because over the years we have learned that the protocol is helpful, but it can be improved by a more personalized approach. And this is, I think, where I want to stop. Maybe the last slide shows you that I think that when being in the Netherlands, small is beautiful, but especially beautiful to organize because it's not as extended and complicated as it might be in other healthcare systems. And of course, the success we have had many fathers, patients, physicians, and also many mothers, spouses that have supported our patients always in conducting active surveillance. Thank you very much for your attention.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. Now we'll turn it over to Vincent.
Thanks, Howard. Can you hear me all right?
Yep.
Okay, let me just put this up. So thank you very much, Howard, and for the invitation to speak today, which I know was slightly sideways through Ola, but I've been very impressed by the energy that you have in promoting surveillance and by this organization, because the frank truth is that I believe that the only way active surveillance is going to be promoted and increased is through the patients, actually, and through the patient advocacy and understanding. And for that reason, what I want to talk today about is the fundamental issue why surveillance is a problem in many countries. And that is because of fundamental lack of understanding of risk and prognosis when there's a new diagnosis of prostate cancer. So I'll start off by some headlines, which this is all UK, of course, but I'm sure it's familiar to you in America or other parts of the world, that you get these contradictory stories coming through depending on what's the flavor of today. So in this case, in September 2016, we had headlines in the UK saying that prostate cancer survival rates are very high, aggressive treatment isn't the best thing to do, all of the kind of stuff which we have started to understand through our work with surveillance. And this, of course, followed on from the famous PROTECT study, which randomized patients to surveillance and treatment. But just about a couple of years later, suddenly we had these headlines saying that prostate cancer now kills more people in the UK than breast cancer, a low-key killer that must be stopped, and the number of men dying hits an all-time high. So either something changed between 2016 or 2018, or we're talking about the same disease, but like the proverbial elephant and the blind men, we are feeling different parts of it at different times. Now, this is a statistic from Cancer Research UK, which is the preeminent funder of cancer research in the UK. And this is their graphics for prostate cancer. And I want to draw your attention to these purple boxes, which talk about the number of cases of prostate cancer, but also the peak rate of prostate cancer cases. And in this box down here, which looks at age, this is the peak rate of prostate cancer deaths, which basically means that you have to reach the age of 90 years or over to actually die from prostate cancer. Now, in general terms, that means you've got to have a pretty good healthy quality of healthy life to actually die of prostate cancer. So this vast tumor burden, which we're all concerned about, doesn't appear to actually have a lot of effects on mortality for many men. And this is exemplified by data that urologists have known for decades, that the risk of prostate cancer may be high, but the risk of death is low. So what is actually happening here? Well, the truth is it's all about risk. It's all about what does a prostate cancer diagnosis mean? Because each prostate cancer has its own characteristics, which actually then translate into its behavior over time. And for many years, urologists use a very simple three-tier system, which many of you may be familiar with, dividing into low risk, intermediate, and high risk. And this was the standard on which these things were developed. But the key thing is that these models were created not actually based on likelihood of death from prostate cancer, but likelihood of treatment failure. That's where the data came from. But still, that was embedded in our culture, and that went on to translate to how we counsel patients. Now, over time, that has improved and changed. And in the UK, we have made a huge step change recently because we've gone from that simple three-tier system to a five-tier system called the Cambridge Prognostic Groups, which actually has defined 5 groups of patients where we know the behavior and outcomes from treatments are actually very different from each other. Now, I'll come to how this is just one step in the whole pathway, but the crucial thing is our national body, the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, has embodied this in their guidelines. And most importantly, they have stated upfront, outright, that if you have CPG1, which is our best prognostic group, then surveillance is the treatment that you should be offering patients, and only consider radical treatment if surveillance is not acceptable to the patient. More importantly, CPG2, which is the next level up, surveillance is on equal footing with treatments because we have seen lots of evidence that even men with intermediate grade features do very well. It's only when you get to CPG3 and above that treatment becomes much more relevant and the first choice call. So we have a combination of better understanding of risk and prognosis, and we also have our national bodies, which are, by the way, as far as I know, the only guideline body which is not run by doctors, is actually run by an independent panel, which then takes doctors' opinions into account. The CPG model we have shown outperforms even the NCCN criteria and all the other ones by publications independently a couple of years ago, and that's really what's underpinned its adoption in the UK. So we've gone from that three-tier system to being able to put men into these 5 groups. But the way I see it is you're still putting thousands and millions of men into 5 baskets, if you like, and then treating those baskets slightly differently. The real clue about surveillance is actually not to just look at the prostate cancer, but to look at the whole picture. And Harvey Cushing was a neurosurgeon actually from the last decade, an American neurosurgeon, whose views I find really refreshing because he, amongst others, said that a doctor has to consider not just the disease organ, but actually the whole person, and not just the whole person, but the person within his context and in his world. Because the prostate cancer doesn't walk around on 2 legs on its own and have a life. It's actually within a man who's got other things to think about and other functions to think about, let's be honest. So I showed you that data about the peak age of death, and this is where the context comes in. This is data from the Office of National Statistics, looking at what men die from, what people die from in a population, and you can see that cancer that mainly is ischemic heart disease or dementia, cerebral vascular disease, strokes, and things like that. And prostate cancer and other cancers tend to be actually not a key player. So if that is the case, then you really need to think about not just the disease that a man has, but his other life factors before you talk about giving a treatment which is going to affect his quality of life without any true gain in survival. And we know this data because even as far back as 2013, this excellent publication from the PC-based dataset showed that if you look at untreated prostate cancer, so men who present with prostate cancer but don't receive treatment, you really have to look towards the younger age groups and much higher risk disease before prostate cancer death overtakes other cause mortality. So prostate cancer is orange and green and blue, other causes like cardiovascular disease or other things. For almost every other group, particularly low risk and most intermediate risk, the risks are either the same or far superseded by other comorbidities. And of course, if you look at what happens if you treat men, the PROTECT study reported the functional outcomes, incontinence, erectile dysfunction, bowel problems after treatment. And in nearly every metric, these are much, much worse for men who are treated compared to men who are on surveillance. And in fact, if you look at this graph, for example, this is incontinence over 6 years after treatment. Red is prostatectomy. The blue and greens are radiotherapy. You can see that the men who have surgery and are incontinent, the problem lasts for 6 years at a time. Now, many urologists will say, well, my rates are much better than that. Well, the key thing is it depends who you ask. And this data has been replicated not just in the days of the PROTECT study, which is open surgery, but even in robotic surgery as well. Even for erectile dysfunction, you can see the surgical effects are much more severe and last for much longer. So, we are talking about, if you're talking about treatments with no side effects, then why not treat everyone? But when you have significant effects on quality of life, you really have to be well informed about whether you're going to get benefit from that treatment or not. So this is what led us to develop the Predict Prostate tool. And the Predict Prostate tool came from this idea that if we were putting men into 5 baskets, can we put them into their own basket? Meaning to say, could we develop a tool which not only calculated their estimated prognosis or risks from a prostate cancer, but also how much they would gain from having a treatment? And through data sets, which now include over 350,000 men from 4 to 5 countries, the Predict Prostate tool has been developed and has been launched some time ago now, and is available worldwide. And how it works is you put in your data, and we're talking about simple clinical pathological data, which every man diagnosed will have, because to be frank, we have found that those are the most powerful predictors to date. And in this particular example, a 61-year-old man with not much comorbidities and say PSA of 6, his MRI scan shows he's got organ-confined disease, and his biopsy very typically a grade group 1 or Gleason 6 in only 1 score. So you put his details into this, and this is the kind of outputs you get. So this chap in particular, if you look at the top data set, in terms of radical treatment over the next 15 years, the algorithm predicts that 17 out of 100 men will be alive, and actually an extra 2 would be alive because of treatment. And of the men who would not survive, 17 would die due to something else. So in other words, if you did nothing, then 17 of these 100 men with the same characteristics would actually die of natural causes or other causes, and 80 would actually be alive. And treatment, you'd have to treat all the 100, would actually save only 2 extra lives in that time. So this is the kind of tool that we now use in the clinics, certainly in Addenbrooke's in Cambridge, and in many clinics across the UK. And the displays can be changed depending on your level of understanding, because the tool and the website was actually developed with patients and patient involvement to show you different aspects of how you can look at the treatment benefit and the survival benefit from the diagnosis. Now, it's all very well to develop these tools, but what is the consequence? How do they change behavior? So this is a study we did amongst about 200 clinicians. We sent them 10 typical cases they might see in a clinic where they counsel patients, and we showed them the standard stuff, the PSA, the grade, the stage, and said, what do you think is the risk of dying from this type of prostate cancer? Then we slightly changed it and sent it again, but this time we added the Predict Prostate estimates. Now, if you look at the graph, the graphic on the left, the blue dots is actually the Predict Prostate estimate for risk of prostate cancer death for all of these cases here. The green represents a range of opinions from the clinicians. So the first thing you can see is that within the clinicians, there was a huge variation in what they thought the risk of this prostate cancer or the prognosis of this prostate cancer was. And actually, not often did it actually fall within the right middle bracket for what the Predict Prostate estimates say. The other thing we saw is that when they saw the Predict Prostate estimates, there was a 58% likelihood that they would reduce their recommendation for active treatment compared to before seeing the Predict Prostate estimates. So this told us a very important fact that actually, even amongst clinicians, their knowledge base on how risky a prostate cancer is hugely variable and depends very much on who you ask. And if you show them a standardized tool like Predict, they are very likely to change their recommendation for treatment. So what about then the patients? Last year, we published this randomized controlled trial in European Urology, where we sent the Predict Prostate estimates versus no estimates to about 180 men. And we asked them to gauge what the effect of the tool was in actually their conflict or their uncertainty about the right choice to make. And quite predictably, we found that when men saw the predict prostate estimates, they gained much greater confidence in the decisions they were making. They were able to have a better view on actually how their prostate cancer may evolve. And it was found to be a very a tool which patients really like to engage with and to use. So all these things give us confidence that not only can we develop the tool, but in practice, it actually has a material difference on both clinician and patient behavior. As a result, the tool is now endorsed by NICE as the only decision-making tool for use in clinical counseling, and is a CE marked device available, like I said, anywhere in the world. And actually, it is accessed about 1,000 times a month from all these countries, which is really gratifying to see. More importantly, we've been able to translate that into 4 other languages, which is available if you go to the website and have a look. So our key interest has been how do you democratize the information that patients receive, regardless of where they are? How do you take out the factor that a clinician may not actually know much about that risk, even though he thinks he does, and actually make it a much more two-way discussion between the patient and the clinician? So I said at the start that I was keen to see how we could actually do a calculation for each individual, and to some extent we've done that. Chris has mentioned about genetics and MRI. These are all further refining our abilities, but the key point is this, that we do not have data to tell us how MRI or genetics influences prognostic predictions yet, because you need 10 to 15-year data to do that. And I will throw in a guess that actually it probably will not improve on what we already do. As an example, the Predict Prostate tool has an 85% accuracy of prediction. So improving on that is going to be pretty tough. But, you know, I would love to be corrected. Now, the other thing is support and endorsement. Now, I've told you already that NICE have actually endorsed Predict Prostate. But even further, just recently, the East of England, where I work, have developed this tool, and it's a patient-facing tool. And what it does is it allows patients to access the NICE guidelines in the UK themselves. They don't have to go through a barricade of clinicians who are telling them what they should have. They are going to be given access to the information that NICE says. It's not an opinion. It's basically what NICE has said is the recommendations for their particular type of prostate cancer. And that has just been launched in the East of England, and we hope that eventually it'll be used elsewhere. Now, what about actual impact? So this is some data from my own unit, and I show you data from 2016 to 2019 when we were making when we transited from the Cambridge from the old three-tier risk system to the CPG or Cambridge Prognostic Group, and we're starting to use a Predict Prostate tool. I draw your attention to the CPG 1 and 2, which are the kind of men that we look at for surveillance. Now, back in 2016, the number of men who were being radically treated with low-risk disease was approximately 22%. But since implementation of these tools, that has dropped now to about 4%. And even amongst favorable intermediate risks, as you might call it, or CPG2, the number of radically treated men has dropped from 85% down to about 30%. So this is how it can change uptake and how it can change increased active surveillance usage if you simply use an unbiased, fairly provided information tool. Now, conversely, it can also help to reduce undertreatment of high-risk disease, and we've seen that happen as well, but I won't go into that. And how do we compare then against national data? Now, the UK, you've already mentioned, has got a pretty good surveillance uptake rate, but even then, we outperform. In Cambridge, our low risk rate is 5% versus a national average of about 10%. And these are going to continue to improve. In fact, these days, if a man doesn't, with CPG1, doesn't go into active surveillance, there's got to be a pretty good reason why not. Beyond that, we are also interested in another really crucial bit. It's all very well to start somebody on surveillance, but it's pretty pointless if within 1 year they go on to have treatment because they're worried about it. So we have also been focusing on how we can actually improve and refine and keep men on surveillance if it's appropriate to do so. I'm not going to go into details because that's not the topic today, but I can tell you that with a structured surveillance program and over the last few years, a risk stratified surveillance program, we've been able to achieve a 22% AS discontinuation rate, which, as Chris has shown some great data from GAP3, is outperforming the current data from the GAP3 International Consortium. Indeed, only 7% of our men leave from choice. And my problem is actually getting men off surveillance when they do progress. So in terms of how it works, so here's a simple schematic here of how the process occurs in my unit. So if a man has his investigations, is positive for cancer, he comes to a multidisciplinary team where options are discussed. He's then seen in the prostate uro-oncology clinic to discuss his diagnosis and his prognosis using the CPG and PREDICT models. And if they meet the criteria for surveillance and they agree on surveillance, they're booked to a dedicated surveillance clinic, which I run. And then their follow-up is stratified based on other research and data we've got into how often they need to be seen, how often they should have MRIs, and to be very frank, rebiopsies are something we're doing upfront, and after that, we very rarely do them because we found that there's no need for it for most of the cases. So with this in mind, and well, we recently reported our data showing high levels of compliance with active surveillance. We also have an active surveillance seminar, which all men starting surveillance are invited to, and we have a self-directed PSA tracker, which they can use for follow-up. So in summary, the key thing I think in surveillance is actually improving understanding of risk and prognosis, and PREDICT and other tools are all available. They can be used internationally anywhere. They're not limited to the UK. And I hope that this forum will be able to disseminate or at least scrutinize that for yourself. PREDICT Prostate is actually the most validated prognostic tool available and is the only one endorsed by NICE. And we know that it changes clinicians' and patients' knowledge about the risk from a cancer. We have seen tangible effects of using better prognostic models in increasing confidence in taking up surveillance and in carrying on with that. And I think it's absolutely crucial that if a clinician or whoever in the healthcare is counseling men about prostate cancer, that they understand what the disease is about and not just simply go with their biases into it. But equally, you need to have the patients given the chance to be able to look at it themselves and then have a balanced discussion. We have found that well-informed men who understand their prognosis and risk are much more likely to stay on AS, and we have high levels of compliance and engagement. So I'll finish there and pass back to the chair.
Yeah, I guess I'm the chair, so I'm going to pass the ball over to Kevin. Some questions are starting to pop up in the chat. Maybe we can have the speakers answer them after Kevin speaks. And also, I'm hoping that the speakers can interact. And I see that Kevin is a fanboy for the prostate PREDICT, so we can talk about that later. But Kevin, it's your turn.
Excellent. Well, thank you all very much for the opportunity to speak today. My name is Kevin Ginsberg. I am a urologist at Wayne State University in Detroit, Michigan. I work at the Karmanos Cancer Institute, and I also am a member of an organization called MUSIC, which is the Michigan Urological Surgery Improvement Collaborative. Just by way of transparency, I really don't have any relevant disclosures. I do serve on an advisory board for Johnson & Johnson, but that's really unrelated to active surveillance. So what is MUSIC? MUSIC is the Michigan Urological Surgery Improvement Collaborative. We are a group of physician-led organization of over 260 urologists from 45 practices throughout the state of Michigan. And this includes small and large private practices, academic practices, hospital-employed groups, and really in a diversity of settings from urban, rural, suburban locations, and really throughout our entire state of Michigan. We believe it's a very accurate representation of the care that's being delivered in the state of Michigan. Importantly, we actually have, I think we're up to 15 patient advocates now that kind of serve as our compass and make sure that what we're doing from a quality improvement standpoint is important and resonates with patients. And you can see at the bottom, we have a simple yet very lofty goal, which is to make Michigan the best place for urologic care. And when MUSIC started in 2012, that slogan was actually different. That was make Michigan #1 in prostate cancer care, because as we were starting off, we were really a prostate cancer focused organization. You can see now over the 10 years that MUSIC has existed, we really have grown into more than just a prostate cancer organization. We now have initiatives that look at quality of care in kidney stones as well as kidney cancer. But really our first love was with prostate cancer, with a lot of work being done in active surveillance. As Howard mentioned earlier, in the early 2010, 2012-ish range, active surveillance was still a little bit in its infancy. We had, some very encouraging data coming from Johns Hopkins and from Toronto around their 10-ish year follow-up data, which seemed that active surveillance was really a great viable strategy to reduce the overtreatment of indolent prostate cancer. And this was one of the first initiatives we took on as a group in music, is to see how can we increase the use of active surveillance in appropriate men in the state of Michigan. And I'm going to walk, hopefully, everyone briefly through that journey today of kind of how we got from very similar numbers in the United States to now kind of leading in the United States with over 90% of men with low-risk prostate cancer being put on active surveillance. So this is one of our first publications looking at the use of active surveillance in music. This is from 2014, so men that were diagnosed in 2012 and 13, kind of the earlier times within music. And we see that the average at this time was around 50% of men with low-risk prostate cancer were being put on active surveillance. But each dot here represents a different practice. And at the time, there were only 17 practices within music. But we see that the proportion of their low-risk percentage of their low-risk prostate cancer patients that were being put on active surveillance really varied greatly. Some practices really seldomly used active surveillance on the left, and others on the right were very high utilizers of active surveillance. And when we took this a step further and really put this under the microscope and now started to look at each individual surgeon, where each dot now is a surgeon within a practice. The size of their dot represents their volume, kind of how much low-risk prostate cancer do they see. And we see that there's really no rhyme or reason that some very high volume surgeons were using a lot of active surveillance, some high volume surgeons weren't using a lot of active surveillance, and kind of everything in between. There's also low volume urologists that did a lot of active surveillance. And so we kind of as a collaborative got together, discussed these data, and realized there was an excellent opportunity here for quality improvement for us to increase the use of active surveillance being offered in the state of Michigan and appropriate men, as well as decrease a lot of this variability. And as we began to tackle this problem, one of the first things that came up was kind of who is appropriate for active surveillance. This is from an appropriateness panel that we convened, where we got around 30 experts in prostate cancer together, and we went over 160 different scenarios. It's definitely every kind of combination and permutation here of Gleason score, the volume of disease, PSA density, race, life expectancy, and again, sexual interest and sexual function, how important that was to the gentleman. And we see here that although it's not important to understand exactly what's going on here, the trend though is to see that we really coalesce around that pretty much all men with grade group 1 or Gleason 6 prostate cancer, regardless if they're low volume, intermediate, or high volume grade group 1, these men were really universally agreed upon as being appropriate or highly appropriate for active surveillance. And it really wasn't until we get to the low volume grade group 2 disease, or Gleason score 7, 3+4, that we start to approach a little bit of uncertainty. But important, none of these scenarios did we agree that men would be inappropriate or highly inappropriate for active surveillance. So again, we took this back to the collaborative. We discussed this as a group, as we do in our triannual meetings. We get together 3 times a year, and we really discuss the progress of our quality initiatives. And we were able to develop a whole bunch of educational resources for the collaborative and for patients to help increase the use of active surveillance. And this is an example of one of the resources we were able to generate. This is the roadmap for favorable risk prostate cancer. And this really provided a conceptual framework for urologists, how they can think and kind of mentally approach active surveillance, as well as from a more clinical standpoint of how to actually implement and perform active surveillance. And this is, again, just an example from this roadmap. It's around 20 to 30 pages long of just, again, some a little bit more guidance for how to perform active surveillance, both in terms of the consideration for evaluating someone to ensure that the gentleman is indeed appropriate for active surveillance, as well as then the how to actually perform active surveillance once a man is on active surveillance. And again, this was very importantly fed back to the collaborative, discussed. We talked about our hesitations, what could we do to help increase this use of active surveillance over time. And really over the past 10 years, we think that we've really been able to accomplish quite a lot here. This is looking at a recent publication where we compared the use of active surveillance for men with low risk as well as favorable intermediate risk prostate cancer here. In blue, we have men that were diagnosed with prostate cancer in the United States in SEER, which is just a national cancer registry in the United States. And we compare this to men in music in red. We see here when music was just starting off, kind of in its infancies, its numbers, our use of active surveillance really mirrored that of the remainder of the United States. But as we began to really focus on this from a quality improvement standpoint, discuss this at our meetings, feed data back to members so they can see how well they were doing with their use of active surveillance, we see that really active surveillance has taken off and exceeded the rest of the country. When we compare this just among men with low risk prostate cancer, we have left here, on the left, we have men with low risk prostate cancer in the American Urological Association's quality registry called AQUA. We see here that in 2021, 60% of men in this national registry with low risk prostate cancer went on active surveillance. And when we compare that to music, we see that in 2021, 90% of men with low risk prostate cancer were put on active surveillance. And so we believe that, again, we've made a lot of tremendous strides. Well, how have we been able to do this? One, I think we owe a lot of credit to our patient advocates. Again, they are our compass. They ensure that what we are doing and what we propose to do from a quality improvement standpoint really matters to patients and really resonates with the voice of the patients. Additionally, music is a bit of a unique organization. Everyone is there voluntarily. And so as a consequence, there's tremendous buy-in because urologists are there because they want to provide the best care possible to their patients, and they want to improve, and they care about improving the quality of care that they're delivering. Additionally, music is a very unique environment. It is a collegial, collaborative, non-competitive group. This isn't a handful of practices kind of stepping on the necks of others to get ahead, but rather this is a group of people that want to leverage everyone's experiences to see how can we improve and how can we be better together. It's really embodies the mentality of a rising tide, kind of lifts all boats. Additionally, I think the registry is integral to the success. For someone who does quality improvement work and for people who care about quality improvement, you really have to know where you are going. You have to be able to measure your success to figure out what you've done in terms of improving quality. And it's kind of far too easy that if you don't really know your numbers and your practice patterns, it's a little too easy to just say, of course I use active surveillance, so I use a lot of it. And no, I don't overtreat low risk disease. But really, if you don't have those numbers and you aren't able to really inspect that and take a introspective look into your practice patterns and your practice patterns and how that may differ from the remainder of your peers in the States, that's really an integral aspect here. And so here's an example of what this looks like. This is an example of a sample score report that is distributed to music urologists. And this is distributed at our triannual meetings. They get a physical copy of this, and this is also available in real time. They're able to log into the registry at really any moment in time and see their numbers. And this is, again, made up. This isn't any particular practice, but this is just an example of here at the top, they can see what their biopsy infection rate looks like in their practice or in their provider as well, compared to the rest of the collaborative. And as here are some metrics around the use of active surveillance. And we see here an example of how the use of this practice's active surveillance differs from that with the rest of the collaborative. And they may be able to then say, well, we're kind of lagging behind everyone else here. Are we doing something wrong? Are we doing something different? And they can then use this to kind of drive and change their practice patterns. Additionally, we're very lucky in music to be supported by Blue Cross Blue Shield. We have an excellent partner in Blue Cross Blue Shield of Michigan who provides very valuable financial support to the collaborative. There are actually 17 of these quality consortiums in the state of Michigan. Of course, music is the urology one of these, but there's also ones for radiation oncology and medical oncology, and orthopedic surgery. And so, Blue Cross Blue Shield funds all of these initiatives, and they really make it just a no-brainer for urologists to participate. It's very easy to participate. They fund the data abstraction mechanism for music. So as a clinician on a day-to-day basis, we don't have to do anything outside of our normal routine care that we would already provide to patients. As far as the data abstraction being generated into the registry that then gets fed back to me so I can understand my practice patterns and how I'm doing compared to my peers is something that I don't even have to think about. It really all happens behind the scenes. And additionally, there's a potential small financial component incentive as well that we as a group set quality metrics as they pertain to prostate cancer, active surveillance, or reducing the number of opioids that are prescribed after prostatectomy, or various metrics with kidney stones or kidney cancer care. And if we hit those metrics, Blue Cross Blue Shield actually agrees to provide a small increase in reimbursement to music urologists. And additionally, there's around 20 full-time folks that work at the coordinating center, which is the kind of administrative mechanism to music, and Blue Cross Blue Shield funds that as well. And these are folks that help generate these score reports. They maintain the registry, as well as provide statistical support for a lot of the data that you saw just a moment ago. And again, there's a very large educational component to music as well. We get together as a group at our triannual meetings. We talk about progress of our various quality improvement initiatives as they pertain to prostate cancer care, active surveillance, as well as our other initiatives. And we had really healthy and robust discussion about where we think we should be moving the collaborative, what metrics and what is important to our members. And again, I think that leads a lot to our success. Is this is not, one or two people dictating to the group, but again, this is a real comprehensive buy-in from the group about what they think is important and what they want to focus and improve upon in their practices. And again, we have a whole host of resources, both for patients as well as for urologists and physicians. This is just a snippet of some of the prostate cancer resources. Again, there's actually dozens of these on our website, musicurology.com, both for urologists and for providers, as well as for patients. So I would encourage everyone to take a look there. It's freely available for everyone at musicurology.com. And then here's some examples of just some educational videos for providers on here. And we believe although we are predominantly a QI focused group, our goal is to improve the quality of care that we are delivering to our patients. We do understand that we have a unique registry, and we are able to share a lot of the lessons that we've learned to the larger urologic community. And this has been in the form of research and peer-reviewed manuscripts. And since the 10 years that music has been around, we've published over 80 peer-reviewed manuscripts, 20 of which are pertaining to active surveillance. We believe that helps. We believe we've been able to share a lot of our experience with the larger urologic community, which helps hopefully increase the impact of music's work outside of just the state of Michigan, but to our colleagues nationally and internationally. So in summary, what I think has helped make music special is, again, I think it's the buy-in is really key here. This is not like pulling teeth. This is a group of people that care about providing the best care possible, improving the quality of their care. And as a consequence, our members are really engaged. And again, they help drive these initiatives. They help pick the initiatives to ensure that it's really aligning with what they think is important, as well as what we think is important with our patient advocates. The data is integral, is not only the backbone, but is the heart of music. That without having our data being fed back to our members, again, in real time, it's impossible to know really what your practice patterns are if you don't have that ability to fall back upon that and really take that look in the mirror and see what you're doing from a practice standpoint. And again, we're very grateful to have a very reliable partner in Blue Cross Blue Shield of Michigan. They really make participation to be a no-brainer. They've really reduced any sort of administrative burden to physicians, and the barriers to participation are minimal. And as a consequence, again, I think that that's been a key component to our success as well. And again, here's our website at the top. There's lots of great resources for patients as well as for urologists on there. And I will hand it back over now to Howard.
Hooray. Well, at this point, we have about 20 minutes left. And maybe our speakers can turn on their mics and their cameras, and we'll give them a couple of questions. But I'm going to take advantage of my moderator position and all the power that I have, and I'm going to represent Sweden a little bit. Unfortunately, our speaker from Sweden couldn't make it, but here's a few facts. The incidence of prostate cancer is the same as in Sweden as in the United States. And active surveillance was launched in Sweden about 10 years later than in North America. But the Swedes, we Swedes, have achieved better than 90% uptake of active surveillance versus 60% in the United States. And why is this? Well, the Swedes attributed this to urologists having, Swedish urologists having low incentive to perform surgery through their national healthcare system. Also, lawyers have low incentive to sue urologists in Sweden, in which case, if a doctor misses a cancer that becomes metastatic, he's unlikely to be sued. So these are two of the issues that the Swedes think make a difference for them. But meanwhile, I'd like to hear what Chris and Vincent have to say about those incentives, and also Kevin, what you think about incentives for urologists, because you've achieved Swedish-like numbers in the United States, certainly not the land of social democracy. Any rate, so any one of you want to pick it up? Kevin, how about you?
Sure. So again, it's very difficult for me to say, drawing a comparison to other healthcare systems, but I will say that, at least we've been able to demonstrate, and this isn't just one or two large academic groups carrying everyone else in music, but this has really been, everyone has really raised their rates of the use of active surveillance. In fact, we estimate probably around 70+% of the urologists in music are actually in private practice groups. And so it's really, although there may be financial components to certain practice patterns, I think that these are not insurmountable barriers, because I think we've shown here that in the state of Michigan that really large private practice groups, academic groups, hospital employed groups really can all lean in and provide a lot of active surveillance.
Yeah, I just thought that it was ironic that people always point to the incentives on the part of urologists. I have seen calculations that urologists in the US can make more money with active surveillance patients over 3 years or more than they would if they'd done surgery. But, Vincent or Chris, any comment on incentives?
Well, as I told you, Howard, it is, taking out the financial incentive is a good thing. And to harmonize more with everybody's joy. I mean, Vincent also showed us, just like Kevin, that it is a joy to work together and to work on the promotion of health of people, to improve on technologies, and that itself is an incentive to participate in a world in which what you say and what you do together with your patients is important. And that's the best reward above the financial incentive. So too much, let's say, emphasis on this, I would say would not be beneficial. For example, Sweden always has been a country that has promoted the quality of health tremendously, even before the whole screening issue of prostate cancer was relevant in Europe. Sweden was one of the first to say, well, we shouldn't start screening because it will diminish our quality of life. Whether that's correct or not. And it's definitely true that in Sweden, the mortality of prostate cancer is higher than anywhere else in Europe. This conservative approach has helped the Swedish population to go into active surveillance. And that might be a little bit of contrast to the culture that is in the United States, in which every gained year to your age is of more, or might be interpreted by many people as a larger gain than quality of life.
Gotcha. Vincent, anything you want to add? Because if not, we can move on to the next question.
I think that I'm always a bit perplexed by this because actually the final decision about whether to have treatment or not is not the clinicians, it's the patients. Now, how do you empower someone to make that decision? We never do that in the UK. We never recommend a treatment option for someone. We give them options and we give them the information to make decisions. So I think that there should not be worry amongst clinicians that they're going to suggest the wrong thing because it is about shared decision making. And the tools we've been developing is exactly answering the question, how do you actually provide the same information that is understandable by both the clinicians and the patients? I think that there is incentives to treat, which is not just financial, but reputational. And I remember very clearly the era of robotic surgery when there was a huge bun fight on getting low-risk prostate cancers to get robotics so that you could show good surgical margins. Thankfully, we're way past that stage now. So I think the only way to address this, frankly speaking, is to actually empower patients to ask questions. And I think both Chris and Kevin have alluded to that here. I put much less store and confidence in the clinicians to do this.
Gotcha. Phil, we have a question from Anthony Henry, and we should add that the Walnut Foundation in Toronto was another supporter of this meeting. So I don't know if Anthony can come on and ask his question, or Phil, do you want to ask for him?
Sure. Let me just find it. So Anthony asks whether the populations that are more impacted adversely, that is Black men, are those populations factored into the development of the PREDICT tool, and how might the PREDICT tool help them? So this is a question for Vincent.
That's a question I get a lot of the time. I think there is, again, some misconception here. There is tons of data which has shown that like for like, men of Afro-Caribbean descent have the same outcomes as white men. The question is when they present and how well you characterize the disease. If you go to the PREDICT website, there is actually an FAQ on this issue, which shows that actually it doesn't make, like I said, if it's like for like, it doesn't make a difference. We have validated PREDICT in the SEER dataset, which has a lot of Afro-Caribbeans, in fact, men of huge diversity, and the model works just as well. There's a paper we published looking at an artificial intelligence model, which actually dissected all of this by populations. We have no hesitation in saying that the model works very well, regardless of race and ethnicity, as long as you are entering at the same point and you have the same tests and risk assessments done.
Thank you.
Thanks. And Anthony's experience has been interesting because he's had to kind of find his own way with active surveillance. He's had a lot of pushback in the Black Canadian community from men who say, well, you know, active surveillance is not for us. And so Vincent contradicts that, and so does Anthony. Let's see. Now, all three speakers mentioned involvement of patients, and that was very refreshing for us, those of us who are advocates. But, you know, can you give some specific examples how people in this audience can participate in help increase, kind of move the needle on active surveillance? Anybody?
If I can say so, I would emphasize the words that Vincent was saying about giving information. And it's very valuable for clinicians or anybody who's making this kind of information on active surveillance or on treatment of treatment choices to get this feedback from the patients, how the wording is. In the Netherlands, for example, we've seen that there's approximately between 5 and 10% of, let's say, so-called medical illiteracy. Whatever we present, it's not being understood. And so there's a whole new surge of clinicians that are trying to dig into this subject. How can we reach out with correct information? The only thing where we can lean on is that we get feedback back from patients saying, I do not understand this. what is happening here? Can you explain this to me? Can you make a graph? Can you put it in numbers? Everybody will have their own experiences, but that would be very helpful for us. Give feedback on information.
I gotcha. Anybody else?
So I think that's absolutely right. And in fact, when we were developing Predict, we worked with the Winton Center for Risk Communication in Cambridge, which were very passionate about how risk is conveyed and explained. I think there are other factors. Number one is that you cannot give a message on diagnosis and prognosis in one consultation. So we never do. When we see someone and they have a new diagnosis, we tell them the diagnosis first, and then we at least have 2 different separate interventions afterwards with the patient to go through the decision-making before they make a final decision. And finally, actually, as Chris says, providing information in numbers and values is critically important, and that's what Predict tries to do, really, is to put an image around what the likelihood is going to be. But the other thing I would say is that you've got to be reinforcing that through the active surveillance journey. It's not that you do it once and after that it's fine. You've got to keep on doing that, and you've got to keep on reinforcing and reassuring that this is a disease which can be followed in their particular circumstance.
Yeah, Vincent made a good point earlier. Something I've written about. I've just been shocked at the high dropout rate. We talk about increasing numbers of men going on active surveillance, but from what I've seen, from 50% to 2/3 drop out 5 to 10 years after going on active surveillance. How long can we stay on active surveillance, and why are people dropping out?
So Howard, actually, after you and I spoke about this over the summer, I went back and I asked our analysts to look at this in music, and we have numbers that are very similar to what you would see at Johns Hopkins and University of Toronto. That after around 10 years, like you said, 50% of men will leave, and some of that transition to treatment is appropriate if there is increase in grade and identification of clinically significant disease. But much to your suggestion, I looked to see how many men were leaving without grade reclassification. Because if we're saying treating someone with a grade group 1 disease up front is over treatment, well, treating someone 2 or 3 years later still has grade group 1 disease isn't any better. And as a consequence of your suggestion, we looked at this in music, and it's around 30%, which is very similar to what we saw in GAP3 when Vincent presented that data. And again, due to your suggestion, we have actually made this a quality metric in music to try to reduce the number of men that are transitioning to treatment that have not had grade reclassification prior. So thank you for that suggestion. And so without even knowing it, you are influencing our treatment patterns.
I had no idea, but something in my own experience, I was invited to be the patient advisor on a study. And it was a big study. Tens of thousands of men were asked their opinion on their treatment. And this was in UK, Germany, and US. And so I looked it over, and the researchers had not bothered to look at active surveillance, apparently. So I asked them, and it turned out that they had active surveillance in their database, but they just didn't report it. And so they ended up rewriting their abstract, and it was presented at some meeting in Europe over the summer. But but that was odd. That was the biggest contribution I had, was just to be a nag about active surveillance. They had the data, but they didn't include it. So, so the guys in the audience or the women in the audience could get involved with this sort of thing, right?
I got a question for you,
Oh,
Howard.
Go
Yeah,
ahead.
I apologize. I missed the first half of the presentation. So I want to ask the panelists, for people in active surveillance, could you recommend 3-4 concrete steps to check for the progression of the disease so that we can make the right decision, whether we seek treatment or we continue active surveillance? What are the steps that you would recommend?
Now, Vincent, your algorithm isn't really designed for that, right? Is there something else?
Do you mean if somebody's already on surveillance, Howard?
Right.
Yes, that's correct.
So obviously, as Chris pointed out earlier on, and Kevin alludes to, this is actually the next phase of active surveillance. Because we all know active surveillance is a good thing for grade group 1, CPG 1, low risk, whatever you want to call it. And also for a lot of men who are in the favorable intermediate risk, the next level up. But right now, the protocols for surveillance are standard. They are one size fits all. And we see them at the same intervals, and we do the same old things. And Chris will know that GAP3, which is the massive international consortium, is very engaged in trying to do personalized follow-up. In America, Kevin and his group and Cooperberg and the group are all looking at biopsy schedules. And we are very interested in my center about this. And we've actually implemented a risk stratified surveillance protocol over the last 3 years. Now, what that means is that we, at the time they start surveillance, we allocate men into 1 of 3 groups, depending on what we have done work on to show their risk of progression is. And we've published this work. So it is work which is specific to our unit. There's no national standard, Michael. So I don't really want to be saying you should be doing this. But I can say to you that we have already found that if you have, we don't have to do anything fancy here. If you know what your grade group is in, what prognostic group you're in, what your PSA density is, which is a really important factor, which is your PSA divided by prostate volume, and also what your MRI shows, you can tailor the follow-up. And we are particularly keen to de-escalate follow-up in men who have a very low risk of progression. In fact, I will tell you that the men in our lowest risk group, we only see once every 18 months, because we know that the chance of them actually developing progression is pretty low. But I would hesitate to say that this is what you must do or anyone else must do. This is work in progress. We're validating it and it's looking very promising. But it can be done. You can tailor your follow-up. It all comes down to your specific circumstances.
Okay.
I
So
really couldn't agree more.
Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry, please.
I'm
Well,
sorry.
if you can't
Does your
agree more,
algorithm
go ahead.
have a calculated sort of like probability of progressions? I mean, based upon all the
Yes,
data you
yes.
mentioned about.
Yes,
It does?
it's been published. It's been published a few years ago. It's not complicated. It's not an algorithm. I'd say it's a risk tiered system. I wouldn't garnish it with the word algorithm just yet. I would say though that we did some really exciting work with a machine learning group earlier this year, where they actually did do a very fancy algorithm which actually updates risk based on every visit a patient has. So this is very exciting and it's a new direction that was published a few months ago.
Like follow up with the last question is that essentially none of us want to have a rectal or transperineal biopsy. What are your thoughts, the panelists, about liquid biopsy? Is any advancement in that area that we can look into that, sort of like having a little bit more data for our watching of the active surveillance or seeking treatment?
I'd say you're a little bit too early with that, Michael. In the more, let's say, extended stages of the disease, these circulating cells can be found, and also liquid biopsies on free circulating DNA. But for the active surveillance routine, it's definitely not there yet. We will be having very much difficulty finding circulating cells if however, and the circulating DNA that we can find at this moment does not discriminate sufficiently enough from other stages in order to be useful in active surveillance. So we need a little bit more of technological development over there, and probably also just more the follow-up of those things that we find now, how valid they are in 10 years' time.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it. Thank you.
I think the best biomarker so far that's been heavily studied to try to predict clinically significant prostate cancer is probably MRI. And we know that the power of MRI is even more magnified when we combine it with PSA and PSA density, the size of the prostate, which is available on the MRI as well. And so I wouldn't be surprised to see in the not too distant future, further integration of MRI into active surveillance protocols and trying to reduce the number of biopsies by substituting more MRIs, understanding that there is limitations currently to the technology. But again, it kind of boils down to the risk benefit. Are we comfortable doing a whole lot of biopsies on many men to avoid so we can catch the few upgradings that have potentially reassuring looking MRIs, or would we rather be more comfortable avoiding doing unnecessary biopsies at the cost of maybe missing the chance to upgrade a few men? So there's still that kind of balance when we talk about avoiding biopsies, but I think that's a very valid discussion that I bring up with my patients about what are we really trying to do with these surveillance biopsies, and what's the utility of it.
Do you think due to this uncertainty, that's why people drop out of active surveillance?
I think that there's Memorial Sloan Kettering, I believe, has done a whole host of studies looking at anxiety on active surveillance, and that is absolutely a reason for discontinuation. But I think the anxiety really decreases, and patients become a lot more comfortable with active surveillance by around that 2-year time point. I personally would look at that from my standpoint as kind of a failure of me to adequately explain the disease to my patients if they were leaving active surveillance due to anxiety. But it is absolutely a very real aspect of active surveillance that I know Howard has been writing a lot about recently that hopefully we can address.
Yeah, we did a survey. We'll have the results soon about anxiety and depression in men on active surveillance. There's a lot of surprising information in there, but I don't think I can share it quite yet. Now, technically, we had agreed to stop around this time, but let me ask if our speakers are willing to stick around for no more than 15 minutes more. If you have to go, you got to go, but if you'd stick around, we might have some questions for you.
That's fine out.
Okay, good. Phil, why don't you take over with another question?
Sure. Oh, sure. I've got one here from Winston Klassen with the Toronto Prostate Cancer Support Group. Winston asks, with regard to compliance at follow-up, is there any evidence of cultural or ethnic issues?
Well, we know from Vincent already that the way people are treated is different, but there's no racial differences. But is there a difference in the thinking of the doctors who were taking care of these patients and offering follow-up?
I don't change my practice for that because I don't think, like I said, if you have the disease characterized well enough, then race does not come into it. Certainly, my personal experience is that Indian men with the Indian wives get more anxious than anybody else, but that's just my particular anecdote about this.
I would agree with what Vincent said. My understanding from looking at equal access healthcare systems, both in the United States as well as abroad, is that my understanding is that African-American men are not at inherently higher risk for more aggressive prostate cancer. That it more appears to be the unfortunate systematic bias and racism in the healthcare system in the United States. And so for me, I feel very comfortable offering African-American men active surveillance, and the surveillance schedules would be that would mirror that of a Caucasian gentleman or a Asian or Indian gentleman as well.
It's funny, I attended a group aimed at an African-American audience, a US group. And I was kind of shocked by the discussion that I heard. And there was a doctor, actually, Kevin, from Detroit. I won't name names because I don't know names. I don't remember. And he or she, was a she, talked about how Black patients, she didn't find them reliable to follow active surveillance. I mean, I don't know what you guys make of that, but if anybody from the audience wants to comment on that, I'm just reporting, so don't kill the messenger.
This is Michael Nguyen. I'd like to add from everything I read about that, I can't really cite exact papers, that Asian people from China, from Vietnam and Cambodian who just recently migrate to this country, the rate of prostate cancer, the 1/100th of people who live here long, like me. I've been in this country, the US, for 55 years. So I think there's some ethnic component, maybe environment, maybe food, maybe whatever that is. But the rate of cancer in people who live in China is 1/100th of the US.
Thanks, Mike. We should give other people a chance here too.
Thank you.
Did somebody else want to comment on that, or I have something else? I was on a panel, I think back in 2017, with a prominent urologist from the University of Oxford. After the meeting, he told me that the future of AS was for patients with favorable intermediate risk prostate cancer. But I'm wondering, is there a shared definition of what that is? Of what, because, all of you spoke about intermediate risk today, but I don't know if what Kevin calls favorable intermediate risk is the same as what Vincent or Chris would call it.
I think we do, Howard.
I'm sorry?
I think that we have a pretty robust, let's say, definition of intermediate cancer that we allow to offer the possibility for active surveillance. And those are the Gleason 3+4 without tri-4 patterns. This is a very well worldwide accepted definition. But as already told, this is only one element of the decision making. So the general patient condition, comorbidity, age, etc., and definitely the PSA density are all influential in the decision making. But if you just call it the SEC intermediate risk cancers, then this is the overall definition that is being accepted, unless Kevin or Vincent want to add something to it.
Well, Kevin, didn't you just did a paper actually, and didn't you include some Gleason 6 intermediates?
Yeah, we did use the NCCN definition, which includes men with grade group 1 disease and a PSA between 10 and 20, as well as men with grade group 2 disease and a PSA less than 10. I agree that I think that this is kind of the next frontier of active surveillance. Again, it can be a heterogeneous group. And so I rely heavily on Vincent's predict calculator. I use this with almost all men with low risk and favorable intermediate risk prostate cancer as I'm going over, active surveillance versus treatment. And really, what do we particularly aim to gain by treating someone up front? And, these men really, I think it resonates with them when you can kind of give them these estimates to say that, by treating you up front of your prostate cancer, we're hoping to reduce the chances that you die of prostate cancer by 2, 3, 4%, 15 years down the line, as opposed to, trying active surveillance. And then if we need to treat you in the future, we've really lost very little in terms of cancer control. So I think it's an exceptionally valuable tool.
Here you go.
That's good to hear, Kevin. I think you're absolutely right. We start off, like I said, with the baseline of the grade group PSA and stage in almost like a box-like structure, but that's only the first step. After that, you use the other things for the nuances. And like I was saying, that I use that also to guide how and how often we see them. So it's actually it's become very complicated. And in some ways, it's become a specialism which has grown and attracted a lot of people into it now, because previously it was thought to be a pretty boring area.
Real quick question, and we'll probably need to quit in about 5 minutes. What percentage in your practices of men who are intermediate risk go on active surveillance? Now, in the United States, for example, it's about 20% overall. I'm sure it's different in the progressive state of Michigan. But what about in England, and what about in Holland? What percentage?
Well, I would, if I would say that would be rather similar, I wouldn't be far off. But all people will be offered the active surveillance possibility. But there's still quite a number of patients that live with the information that the Gleason 7 formally, now of course being scored differently, is a higher risk factor. And as soon as they hear that, they will appreciate some kind of an active intervention quite often far more. So I think your number of 20% might be a little bit higher, but it's not far off.
Although, Kevin, your percentage is much higher than that.
So we recently just published this, and it's around 40 since music started, going back 2012. It's floating around 30%, but actually in our more recent contemporary years of 2020, 2021, we're getting fairly close to 50% of men with favorable intermediate risk disease are electing for active surveillance. And I think there's a consequence of that is when you look at the outcomes of men with NCCN favorable intermediate risk disease, their outcomes really look a whole lot closer to the outcomes of men with low risk prostate cancer than they do to men with unfavorable intermediate risk disease, 4+3 prostate cancers and above. I think there's a pretty distinct separation there. I do kind of very similar to what Chris said, say that this is a higher risk disease than low risk disease, for which active surveillance is the accepted management strategy. But even though it's higher, doesn't mean it's necessarily high. And again, I then lean on the predict tool to again show that even though it is higher, it's still not high in absolute terms of what their risk is with doing active surveillance versus upfront treatment.
And I would agree with that. I think we got to make a distinction between the favorable intermediate and unfavorable intermediate, which is what we call prognostic group 2 and 3 in the UK. In fact, so much so is the difference that we actually use progression to CPG3 as the endpoint for surveillance, because we know that you gain survival benefit quite significantly in that group, but not really if you're favorable intermediate or CPG2. And that ability to actually distinct the group of patients who actually benefit means that we have an endpoint which is actually based on data. And once you have an endpoint, you can actually start to do algorithms which actually predict an event. That's always been a problem in the past when we've relied on fairly loose definitions of what progression is.
We have to be careful. We have to realize to be careful with these numbers, as we know that when using risk calculators upfront before even starting biopsy, we'll avoid a lot of biopsies, and therefore will make our biopsies more accurate for finding relevant disease. And then, of course, these numbers change.
Well, I don't know if Mark wants to make some final comments, but Mark, are you there?
Yeah, I have to unmute myself, though. I've remained muted this whole. What a fascinating program. All of you did so well. And learning about the PREDICT program, I'm hoping that's being adopted more universally in the US than just at music. But Howard, thank you for engaging all of these people, and we very much appreciate the time that you have donated to us. You're really helping men that might well be overtreated, and you're helping us to preserve quality of life of men on active surveillance. So we're very grateful for that. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. So I think this is your last meeting for the year, right, Mark?
It is yes, thank you, Howard. Yes, it is the last meeting for the year. And let me make a pitch again. Sign up for Howard's newsletter.
I'm not getting rich from it, I'll tell you that.
Yeah. Yeah, but you're helping men. That's a good thing. That's its own psychic income. All right. Thank you all for attending today. Much appreciated.
And so,
Welcome.
Thank you very much.
thanks.